Okay, we're back. When we left off last time, we were talking about the difference between directness and indirectness, and I promised you a really good example. So I have two friends. Their names are Pete and Dixie. They're a married couple, and we do a lot of things together. And usually, because they live a little farther out than I do, and we tend to go into the city, they'll do the driving, and they'll pick me up on their way in. So let's say we're doing something one particular evening, and I will call them to ask like what time they're going to pick me up. So this is how the conversation tends to go if Dixie answers the phone. All right, it's more like this. Hey, Dixie, it's Peg. Oh, and she'll say, oh, hey, Peg, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just, getting some stuff done around the house. Oh, yeah, me too. I'm working on this, biology test I have to write for, I have to give my students on Monday. Oh, yeah, I'm testing next week too. And we'll talk for a few minutes that way. And then finally I'll say, so, hey, what time do you guys think you're going to be by tonight? And she'll say, oh, I don't know. How about 7:15? Does that sound good? I'll say, yeah, 7:15 sounds great. Hey, what are you wearing? Blah, 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 blah. And we finish the conversation, we hang up. It probably lasted a good 5 or 6 minutes. If Pete answers the phone, it's an entirely different conversation. So here's what happens if Pete answers the phone. He'll say, hello. I'll say, hey, Pete, it's Peggy. Hey, Peg. Yeah, we're going to pick you up about 7:15. Awesome. All right, see you then. I got to tell you, I like when Pete answers the phone. Now, if Dixie spoke that way when she answered the phone, like, hey, Peg, it's Dixie, or hey, Dixie, it's Peg. Hey, Peg, yeah, picking up about 7:15. Okay, all right, see you then, bye. I think, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with Dixie. I got to rush over there and find out because that is so out of character for her. So it's kind of socialized into us to kind of take the long way around to be a little more social in our communication. Because of that, we tend to be a little less direct. And that's not socialized into men at all, and so they tend to be more direct. The problem is we are judgmental of each other about those things, and here's how it plays out, okay? The concept of meta messages means what are we conveying below the words? So our message will have words to it, of course, but also that message is shaped by our tone of voice, our everything we learned about in the nonverbal unit, right? Our facial expression, our gestures, facial movement, everything. And that tone shapes our message, right? So if you've ever said to somebody, it's not what you said, it's the way you said it, you are reacting to meta messages. And if you've ever said something like, well, I can't believe she would say it that way, then you're reacting not to the message, to the meta messages. So here's the thing. What we realize is that meta messages are generally communicated non-verbally through our tone of voice, facial expression, and that women tend to use more meta messages, meaning we shape our words with more nonverbal. But even more importantly, we tend to perceive more meta messages from male communication. So even though men aren't maybe intending to send a message with their nonverbal, we get one anyway. Understand? So if a male is looking away from me when he talks, I might receive a message from that even though he doesn't intend that message. Does that make sense? Women use and respond to meta messages more than men do. Now that's research-based. We know that it's true, or let's say we know that there's a pattern of it. It may or may not be true for you or for people that you know. Okay, always remember that. These are patterns in the research, not hard truth. But I noticed that, have you noticed in this video, I talk with my hands, folks. I use my hands. I have one of these very expressive faces. So I definitely notice it in myself, for sure. So that's the concept of meta messages, okay? The second bullet on that opening slide, remember where I said there are 3 things that are impacted about our communication. One was how we approach relationships. And one was our style of talking. So our style of talking was indirectness versus directness, and now a second aspect of that, report versus rapport talk. This is, by the way, what was in your text on page 167 in the listening unit. So some genders talk mainly for what we would call report talk. It's about information. It's about telling you what I need to tell you and what you need to know. And when we're done with that, we're kind of done. We don't need to say anything else. For others of us, talk is a little more about connecting. It's about for interaction. We just say what we're thinking, and we talk in order to establish connection with each other. So right away, you can see how we're socialized one way or the other, right? Males are more report talkers. Females are more rapport talkers. Now, I find myself definitely being both, and in certain contexts, I like report talk, like at work. You come in to tell me something, get to the point. Don't ask me where I'm having lunch. Don't ask me, how my kids are doing, because I want to get back to work. So I don't like rapport talk in that instance. But there are times when I know I have to use it because that's kind of what's expected of me. So sometimes, like, I remember I was on a committee, and most of the members of the committee were women, and it felt like the first 6 minutes of every meeting we had, people just kind of chatted about their lives, and I'm like, let's get down to work, people. Time is money. But that's kind of like your expectation in a sense. So it would be interesting for me I wish we were in a class together, because I'd want to hear which style you prefer, but also which style you tend to notice in your communication with men and women. But certainly that's something that Tannen talks about as being a pattern of difference that we observe between male and female style of communication. Okay, we've covered 2 of the bullets. The way we approach relationships, involvement versus independence. Our style of talking and conversation, which was indirectness and directness, and rapport talk and report talk. And now we're going to talk about trouble talk, or the way that we handle problems. And this tends to be a scratching point between male and female communication sometimes. I notice it a lot. So when someone comes to you and it says, I have a problem, you might have the impulse to give them a solution right away, right? Well, here's some advice. Here's what you might try. Or you might have the impulse to listen to them in order to share your understanding, to share some sympathy or empathy. Tannen's work tells us that the pattern we see is that females tend to give the gift of understanding, whereas men tend to give the gift of advice. Now, I have a really dear male friend who I talk to quite frequently, but I notice if I tell him about a problem, the minute that problem gets out of my mouth, he's offering me 2 or 3 solutions. Have you tried this? Did you do that? Did you do that? And I just really want him to listen. Just listen. You know what I really need? I need a sounding board. I need to get it out of my mouth. In a way, talking about it helps me process it. I don't necessarily need him to give me solutions, because when he does that, I have to answer each one of those. No, I didn't do that. Here's why. No, that one wouldn't apply. Here's why. No, you don't want what you're talking about. Listen to me finish my story, right? But from his perspective, like, that's what he's supposed to do, is fix problems, right? We make men in charge of that physical world. Kill the bugs and fix the car. So that's his innate impulse. That's the way he's been socialized. I've learned when I need a male to listen without giving me advice, I tell them that up front. I say, I have a problem I want to talk about, and I really just want to hear myself say it out loud. So if you wouldn't mind being that kind of friend for me, where you just listen, and at the end I might ask you a few questions. Now, I know you're going to want to give me some advice and want to solve my problem, but I'm going to let you off the hook on that. You don't have to be thinking about solutions. Just listen to my problem. Now, the truth is, he is going to be thinking about solutions, because that's the way we've socialized him to be. But I found that I can get my thoughts out without hearing about solutions I should have. You guys, I see this illustrated in cartoons all the time, the way men want to solve things right away. Now, listen, both of these are great gifts. I mean, sometimes we want advice, and sometimes we just want understanding. The trouble is, we make presumptions about it instead of being clear about what we need and want. So I think sometimes it's smart at the beginning of a conversation to say, I have this problem, I want to tell you about it, and then I'd love to hear any advice you might have. And be clear, I'd love to hear your advice. Or, I have this problem, I want to talk it through with you, because that's going to help me process it a bit, but I'm not ready to hear advice yet. So if you have advice, just kind of hang on to that. And sometimes just starting a conversation that way. Okay, there are 2 slides left, and they really talk more specifically about some really behavioral differences in our communication. But this next slide kind of summarizes Tannen's principles, right? So we see that male column, independence, directness, straight messages, report talk, helpful advice. And we see the female column, involvement, indirectness, meta messages, rapport talk, and understanding. Again, not all of these things are going to ring true for you. I hope that they don't. I hope that you want to argue about some of them and say, this is so not true for my experience, because that would be awesome. But I think the only problem comes when we judge each other on the way we talk, right? And in a sense, we feel like if you don't talk the way I do, then you don't feel the way I do, right? If you don't want to sit around and talk for nothing about an hour, then you must not want to connect with me, right? Or if you can't get to the point, then you must not really care about what I think. So for me, this work has been eye-opening in terms of my awareness of how we communicate. I don't know that it's changed a lot of my own communication behavior. I think it has a little, but I notice it, and so I try to make adjustments for it. And when my female friends are more rapport-ish, I understand why. And I can say, I'm enjoying the chat, but I really got to get to work, so let's get to the point, without sounding mean and harsh about it. So for me, awareness is key. Now, this next slide talks about some really specific behavioral differences that we do. Again, this comes from patterns. You may not see this in yourself. One pattern that we notice, and I notice it as a classroom teacher, to be honest, is that while women tend to start more conversations, men tend to interrupt in conversation more, and women will sort of follow that shift. So men might interrupt and shift the conversation, and women will follow along. I notice in class more males will blurt out an answer rather than raise their hand and wait to be called upon. And I like to structure interaction where we don't have to worry about that anyway. But I wonder why females don't want to blurt out, because I'm a blurter for sure. Here's something that's interesting. As females, we tend to listen with very clear nonverbal affirmations. Like we'll nod, we'll go, uh-huh, ah. Okay? Men tend to do less of that. So they might listen with a little more of a blank face. This is why women will often think that men aren't listening to them, because they don't look like what listeners look like to us. But they are listening, right? They're just listening their way. And finally, men tend to use more downward inflection patterns. Do you hear it in my voice? My voice goes down at the end of a thought. In fact, it sounds like every phrase has a sentence after it. But women tend to use more upward inflections in their speech. It sounds almost like every phrase ends in a question. Upward inflections tend to communicate uncertainty or incompleteness of thought or lack of authority. Downward communications, complete thought, authority, certainty. Okay, hear the difference? So that's something I pay attention to in my speech, because if I'm using a lot of upward inflections, I might feel as though my ideas aren't being considered with the same weight as maybe the same idea coming out of a mouth that uses more downward inflections. And finally, this is kind of interesting. Women tend to use more what we call tag questions or maybe qualifiers. So here's a for instance. Somebody asks a question at a business meeting and I say, okay, I'm not really sure if you're going to like this idea, but that's a qualifier, okay? Or I might give my idea and I might put a tag question on it like, so there's my idea, what do you think? Or there's my idea, did I understand that correct? With a tag question. Tag questions and qualifiers sometimes can diminish the weight of a message. So I think that's something for us to be aware of. And men, if they're talking with a group with women, might want to consider using more of those. So I think these are ways not for us to like categorize each other and say, ooh, men and women, we're so different in the way we speak, but rather to say, some of us have been socialized in certain ways. These socialization patterns have resulted in patterns in the way we communicate. The more we can be aware of them, the more we can check for them in our own speech. And here's what's most important, I think, the more we can be forgiving and tolerant of them in each other's speech. Okay, that's all I've got about gender communication. If you found that interesting, I invite you to look into the work more. Again, Deborah Tannen is really the chief person you want to look at. She's not the only one, but if you take a course, you're going to be definitely encountering her work. All right, thanks. That was fun. I hope you enjoyed it.